Today's topic is permitted insects, which is that to surprise most people, there are several types of insects that are mutter, and that's what we're going to be talking about, a bunch of different examples of ones that are or possibly mutter. Okay, and the first group is grasshoppers, and that is, the Torah has 4 psukim talking about sheretz oif, or flying insects. 2 of those say the general rule, which we would have expected, which is that you can't eat them, and the other 2 tell us that there are 8 types of grasshoppers that you are allowed to eat. They are sheretz oif, but they're ones that are mutter. Those are brought in Shulchan Aruch and Siman Pei, which is the siman right after the regular siman about insects, which is Pei Daled. And a very important part of that din is that the only we paskin that the only grasshoppers that are mutter are the ones that have the name chagav. They have to be called a chagav. Well, Ashkenazim don't have any more Messiah of which ones are included in that group. So basically that means is we can't eat any grasshoppers because we don't have any ones that we know are Shmoy Chagav. So now there are certain Sephardic communities that do have a Messiah about this, and there is a grasshopper that they eat, and that brings up a question of, are we able to transfer the Messiah from them to me? Which is to say, is the simple thing you would say is, well, they know the one that's kosher, I don't know the one that's kosher, so if he tells me that this is the one that's kosher, then I'll know also, then I'll have a Messiah. That's what you would think. But we once spoke about a different time that 2 basic reasons why that might not be true. The first is a halachic basis, a more direct halachic basis, and that is the Rosh says that a community can rely on another community's Messiah, and the Rajva says they can't. So the Shulchan Aruch understands that these Rishonim are arguing with each other, and therefore he says, and he paskins that you should be machmir on that question. In other words, he would say is, I cannot get a Messiah from a different community. The Shach says, no, the Rosh and the Rajba are not arguing at all, and that they're talking about 2 different cases. And in our kind of a situation where they have the Messiah, and I just don't have any Messiah at all, we just don't know anything, we have no opinions one way or the other, then we could be Mekel, and Ramosha says like the Shach. So, but this question of whether we can get so that's one halachic question of can we get a Messiah from another community? This is a more direct halachic question. But the second issue is that, we have to wonder, did their Messiah start from something that we wouldn't agree with? Like, for example, in our case, there's a simple example of that, which is maybe they eat this grasshopper because they hold like the Rishonim who hold that it doesn't have to be Shmoy Chagav. Just has to meet the other criteria that the Torah describes of how you know which is a kosher grasshopper. In which case, their, so to speak, Messiah is not really my kind of Messiah. So these are different questions about whether you can or cannot, and Pois can take different stands on this, whether I could learn from them which grasshoppers I can eat. Okay, now let's move to another example, and that is that insects that are land insects, as opposed to flying ones, land insects are only usher if they either were born on a plant or something that's attached to the ground, that's one way, or they left their original habitat and they walked on something that's attached to the ground. Okay, so but before that happened, if they weren't born attached to the ground, or they didn't leave their habitat, then they are mutter. So one example of where this heter where this comes into play and makes an insect actually mutter is that there's something called a Drosophila fly, and the larvae, that's a young stage of those insects, are found in raisins. So what happens is that this Drosophila fly lies their eggs when they find juice oozing out of a fruit. As the fruit is like drying out, the liquid is draining out of it, then that's where they lay their eggs. So like with raisins, what happens is you take the grapes off the tree, off the vine, you lay them down on the ground in the sun, and the juice oozes out, it dries in the sun, and it turns into a raisin. So what happens is the larvae, the eggs were laid inside of that raisin. They eventually hatch in the raisin, and they stay put. They don't leave. Well, eventually they leave. Eventually they grow up and leave, but obviously when they leave, it's not a question of a raisin anymore because they're not there. But they don't come back. So if we find larvae inside the raisin, this is an insect that we know was laid, that was born when it was not attached to the ground. It did not leave the fruit that it was born in, because if it would leave, it wouldn't come back, and therefore those raisins are mutter, but those insects inside of them, those are mutter. Another example is, there's a machlokes, what happens if we have an insect that was born, instead of being attached to the ground in our traditional way, it was attached to an otzach nokov, a flower pot that's not, has no hole in it, so it's like separated from the ground. Is that considered that it was born on the ground or not born on the ground? Now, there are a lot of ways to grow produce hydroponically. It means like in water or other unusual growing materials, and they could be done, not always, but in many cases they qualify as an otzach nokov. And that means is that if the infestation is not more than Issa Drabanan, meaning it's a Mir HaMatzah, so at most we have here is an Issa Drabanan to eat this food, so then there's good reason to say we could be makel and say that an otzach nokov is not considered attached to the ground, and the insect is mutter until it leaves its original habitat, meaning go from one vegetable to the next one. Okay, now, that in itself, do I have to be concerned that the insect went from one vegetable to the other one? The Pasha says that I do not have to be concerned about that. So, which means is that if the vegetables had their entire growth in otzach nokov, meaning that not that they grew in like a nursery that was attached to the ground and they moved to this, their whole growth was all in an otzach nokov, then it's very possible, and it's only mean how much of infestation, then you'd be allowed to eat. This would be an example of where you'd be allowed to eat the insects, even though they're just good old-fashioned regular insects. Okay, now I said about this case that there's good basis for assuming the insect did not leave the habitat, but there's a specific case where we don't have to assume that, but we know that it didn't leave its habitat, and that is for leaf miners. What are leaf miners? A leaf miner is a kind of an insect that lays its egg inside the leaf, not on the leaf, in the actual leaf itself, like of lettuce or herbs or something like scallions or celery or the peel of some fruit sometimes. And what happens is when the baby insect hatches, it stays in between the layers of the leaf, and it goes what I call horizontally. I don't know if that's the right word for it, through the leaf. Meaning the leaf. Imagine if a leaf has 3 layers to itself. It eats the center layer and it goes sideways through the leaf, but never pokes through. The bottom and top layer of the leaf stay on. So it eats its way, and you could actually see it. But the way you could see it is that you see that instead of having let's say a leaf or a piece of scallion that would be just green, instead you see this trail of space where the baby, with his infant, ate out, and it's all of a sudden it's not green anymore. There's like this trail of no more green, and sometimes there's like black spots. That's its things, like its droppings that it left behind. And after a couple of weeks of it tunneling through the leaf, and eventually it makes a hole in one of the out towards the outside, and it gets out and it flies away. So with all insects, we always have to be concerned. How do we know that it didn't move from one vegetable to the next? Maybe it moved from its habitat to the next, to the next leaf over. But over here, we know for sure it didn't leave its habitat, because if it leaves its habitat, just like we said beforehand, it's not coming back. Once it leaves the leaf, it's gone. It's not going to come back again. So if the insect is in there, that's the concern, is that the insect might be inside there. If the insect is in there, then we know that it never left its habitat, which would mean is that, again, if it was growing in an otzach nokov, then we would be allowed to eat it. We would say that we know it didn't leave its habitat, and it would be a insect which is mutter. Okay, now let's move to water-based insects. Water-based insects have a similar halacha to the land-based insects, and that they're not usher until they leave their original habitat. So the Gemara says that if the worms that you find in the intestines of fish, those are usher. And that's because if they're found in the intestines, then your concern is that this worm came from the outside. The fish swallowed it. That's why it's in the intestines, and therefore, so they swam around in the sea, and now they're in the fish. So then they're usher, because they wherever they were born, I don't know where they were born, but they weren't born here. So they've moved from their habitat, and they would be usher. But what happens? The Gemara says if you find worms in the flesh of the fish, then we assume those worms were born right there where they are, and therefore they never left their habitat. They were born in the flesh of this fish, and they've always been here, and therefore the Gemara says those worms are mutter, and that din is brought in Shulchan Aruch. Nobody disagrees with that. It's a pretty straightforward din. But in 2010, the people who said that maybe we should be machmir about a specific kind of worm called the Anisakis worm, found in the flesh of wild salmon and many other fish, and they had reasons to believe that these fish are different than the one that the Practicum were speaking about, and the Gemara is talking about. Rabbi Yashiv agreed with them. He thought those people were correct. And some of the American Hashgachas have taken on that strict stance to say is that these are not the ones that the Gemara talks about, and therefore they say you should not eat them. You have to remove the worms, the Anisakis. But most of the American Hashgachas take the position that they are mutter, and they're part of what the Gemara says. In fact, the reason why everybody knows about Anisakis worms is because they're very popular and very common. And there's lots of studies about them, and that's exactly what the Gemara is talking about. Okay, so that's another worm that is potentially mutter. At least many take the position that worm is mutter, basically like the Gemara says. And now let's move to another case of a excuse me of an insect, of a water-based insect, and that's a different Gemara. The Gemara says that from the perspective of insects, of sheretz hamayim, of insects that are in the water, there are 4 different types of bodies of water, and the status of insects depends on them. Depends on which body they were born in. Okay, the most strict is if an insect was born in yam and nochalim, seas and rivers. Those are usher based on a pasuk. There's a beferish pasuk that a sheret that's born in the water, that's born in yam and nochalim is usher. How do we define yam and nachalim? What's the defining feature of them? So that there are ones that are noivim, means there's water continuously flowing into them, like from a spring. From some places, water always flowing in, and the water is moishkin. It's always moving. The water is in a constant state of moving. So that's the defining features of a sea or a river. Okay, so that's the most strict. The bugs that are born in those rivers are asur. Now, what happens if an insect is born in a bar, in a pit, or another body of water? It's attached to the ground, but it's not noivim or moishkim. There's no spring that fills it, and there's nothing. The water doesn't flow from there any place. It just sits there in the bar. So those insects are mutter until they leave the bar. When they leave the bar, they become asur. As long as they're inside the bar, they're mutter. Okay, a third group is even more calm. That is, what happens if bugs that are found in kalim? Okay, a kalim are like a cistern, some kind of a holder of water. So those are not even attached to the ground. The virus are attached to the ground. These are not even attached to the ground. So so these are even further removed from yam and chalim, and again they're mutter again until they then those are mutter. Now, the fourth case, which is the case that's most important for our discussion, is a middle case, and that is what happens if we have charitzin and itzim. In English, we say the trenches and channels. Okay, so that water is moishchen. The water flows. It goes through like an irrigation canal. It flows, but it's not noivim. It doesn't come from a source that keeps flowing. That water keeps pouring water into it. It's sometimes water is and sometimes water is not. Okay, so it has moishchen, but it's not noivim. So the Mechaber brings those who say that it's mutter, others say that it's also. It bring 2 days, and the shachs and most people follow the shach who says you should be machmir about bugs born in charitzin and itzim. Okay, so those are the different categories of excuse me, of bodies of water. This whole discussion was a very theoretical, basically discussion until people figured out that there's a kind of bugs called copepods. And dead copepods were being found in the drinking water of New York City. It was special to New York City because they didn't have to filter their water. Their water was so clean that they didn't have to filter it, so they'd never filter these out. And a big part of the question about whether one has to do something about those copepods in the water was about whether there's the reservoir, the final reservoir, or basically the big final reservoir before the water goes to the city is called the Kensington Reservoir, and that's where the copepods are. And the questions, a lot of the shaila had to do with the status of that Kensington Reservoir. And there are 2 two big questions. The first is the water in Kensico considered to be noivim? Is it coming from a spring? Another one, as we saw, that's very important to know whether it comes from a spring. So Rebelsky said that only 2% of the water in Kensico comes from springs, so it's not noivim. It's not coming. It's basically 98% of the water is not coming from a spring, so that's not considered noivim. It's not that little bit is nothing. Okay? Others said, first of all, they argued that even a small amount is enough. Okay, but 2% seems like a really small amount. But they said, but there's another argument, and that is that where does the other 98% of the water come from? So the bulk of that water is coming from 7 other reservoirs, smaller reservoirs, which feed water into Kensico, and those reservoirs are spring fed. So basically, the water that is coming from a spring going into these 7 other reservoirs and then making its way down to Kensico. So essentially, Kensico is noivim because it's coming from a spring through another yam, through some other small reservoir than to this one. So that's a reason to think that it's noivim. Okay. Now the second question is, does Kensico qualify as moishchim? So moishchim means that the water is in constant movement; it flows. So in practice, the water never leaves the reservoir unless somebody opens up specific gates that allow the water to flow into the pipes that go to feed the people in New York City. So Rebelsky said, if water can only get out when a person chooses to let it out, he says that's what a bar is. A bar is a big container of water that a person chooses whether the water should go in or out, but it doesn't flow by itself. So moishcha means it flows by itself, like in a river or a lake. No one tells the water in the river to flow; it just goes by itself. But here, where a person has to choose to draw the water out of it, open up the gates, let the water out, that's a not moishcha and it's considered a bar. Okay, now 3 arguments were made against this. The first is that every day there's approximately 1.2 billion gallons of water flow out of this reservoir through these huge pipes that, again, spread water all around New York City. So how can you say that if there's 1.2 billion gallons of water flowing out of a place that it's not moishchim? So it's true that a person has to open the gates, and there's more than one. So first we open up number 1, then tomorrow we open up number 2. But the mitzvah is there's water flowing out of it. Basically, not necessarily. Sometimes it stops, but basically at all times there's loads and loads of water pouring out. That's a reason to think that it's moishchim. Second reason is that there's a Ravid, maybe even the Ramah, says that something called bibrim are considered moishchim, and bibrim are a kind of canal where the people control the water. So exactly this situation of water control. Water that flows, but it flows by people choosing to let the water go in and out, there's a Ravid who says that is considered to be moishchim. And last is that it could be that this whole thing is a mistake in the sense that moishchim might be the fact that it's such a big reservoir, the water ebbs and flows by itself. It always moving back and forth. That in itself might qualify as moishchim, even if the water would never leave. Okay, so for these different reasons, many people rejected Rebelsky's suggestion that the Copepods are automatically mutter. In other words, Rebelsky was saying that it should be mutter because it's water in a bar, and bugs in a bar, and bugs in a bar are mutter. And so many people rejected this thinking of Rebelsky. There are other reasons that are not relevant to our discussion right now, which is maybe the bugs are so small, maybe they're not mutzi, but those are other possible reasons. But this is as a reason Rebelsky was saying that the bugs are not even bugs that are usher altogether. Okay, now our next group of bugs that are mutter is that if an insect stays around for 12 months, it gets dried out. It gets dried out to the point that it becomes like sort of disintegrated, and like afra alma, and it's mutter. Okay, so what happens if? Excuse me. So that's if an insect just dries out for 12 months, it becomes mutter. What happens if it's in some kind of a situation, something that preserves the insect, that doesn't let it dry out, then it stays usher. So the Shulchan Aruch's example of that is when you have if an insect's in jam or honey, so then it preserves it, it keeps it from it actually does not dry out, and that bug stays usher. And the same thing for us, a more modern example of that, is if you have frozen herbs and vegetables. Okay, freezing preserves things reasonably well in the state they were in. We assume it does the same for the bugs also. So if you have frozen herbs or other frozen items that have bugs in them, the bugs are also, even though 12 months have passed on. Okay, now that's for frozen herbs. But dehydrated herbs, which is the kind of herbs that most people use in their homes, in their pantries. I'm talking about they buy fresh herbs. The herbs that we have, that come in a jar, those are, as a rule, those are dehydrated. And how do they make dehydrated herbs? They take the herbs, put them on a tray, and basically put them into an oven to dry out. And the poskim say that mechanical drying has the same effect on the insects as letting them dry it for 12 months. And therefore, those dried herbs are also, the bugs that would be in there are also mutter because they're dried out. And as I said before, dried out herbs are mutter. Now, there are countries that they dry the herbs just by putting them in the sun for a couple of days. They don't use, heat. You don't use ovens, things like that. So in those cases, this side would not be true. But most herbs are not like that. Most herbs are dried in an oven, and that mechanical drying is enough to make them considered to be mutter. Now, there is another way to dry out that some people use. Those are much more expensive and fancy herbs, and that is freeze drying. And freeze drying is, what you do is you freeze the item you want to do. In this case, it would be an herb. You freeze it, and then you pour it into a chamber which is warm but has a vacuum to it, and the water portion of the food goes from water, meaning from being solid. From ice, from being frozen as a solid to a gas, but it never passes through the liquid phase. It's a special process called freeze drying. It takes about 24 hours to do this, and the reason people do it is because it's much more delicate on the herbs and on the other food, and preserves their taste and the consistency much better. Okay, much better than the heat of dehydration, like in an oven, etc. Now, so the question is like this: if the whole idea of freeze drying is to be very gentle and keep its original shape, maybe the same thing happens to the bugs. Maybe the bugs, just like I said beforehand, that frozen vegetables are preserved, or frozen herbs, frozen bugs, get preserved, or bugs that are in honey and jam get preserved. So maybe over here also they get preserved. So to find the answer to that question, Rabbi Gissinger, and then I did it myself later also, freeze-dried all kinds of insects. We did this many years apart to see what would happen. And the results were that the insects, on their shape, looked the same. Their whole insides had disappeared completely. But their shape, they looked just like they had gone in. They had the same, outer appearance. But as soon as you touched them, it completely disintegrated into nothing, into a pile of dust. So the OU's poskim looked at that, and they said that in Cain, that means it's the same as mechanical drying or heat drying or drying for 12 months, and therefore it should be mutter. And for that reason, most Hashgachas assume that freeze-dried herbs do not have an insect concern. Freeze-drying needs Hashgachah for a separate reason, because freeze-dry is also used for shrimp and other kinds of treif things. But that's just to make sure it's used for kosher. But as far as the insects, most assume that there's not a concern in freeze-dried insects. Okay. Now, for our last topic is the size of an insect. And that is, over the past, couple 100 years, science has figured out that there's all kinds of really tiny things that people can't see. And those tiny things that you can't see, or that you see but you don't realize what they are really living organisms. Okay, so at the time when these discoveries started coming out, there were poskim who thought that, well, if they're bugs, then they're usher. Okay, but most assume that if you can't see it, if you can only see it through magnification, then it's mutter. Okay, now, in that perspective, that idea of what's visible, it's assumed that being visible to the naked eye means something that people with average eyesight can see. Okay, but that's pretty accepted, that it has to be people with average eyesight can see the thing. But there still leaves a lot of questions open. Like, for example, what happens if it was, you couldn't see it and you couldn't notice it, but then it got crushed or got killed, and no one can see, you can't tell anymore that it's an insect. It just looks like just a piece of dirt at this point. Does that make it mutter? Now I can't see what it is. I can see it, but I can't see what it is. What happens if you could see it? In general, you could see it, but it doesn't move, or it's not big enough to tell what it is. So I could see it, but I can't see that it's a bug. So is that considered visible because I can see it? Or you say, no, it's not visible. You could see it, but you can't tell without magnification. You can't tell it's a bug. Okay, so contemporary poskim took different positions on this. Those who are strict said the only ones that are mutter are microscopic insects. But insect that once it crosses over from being microscopic to being visible, then that's awesome. That's what the machmirim say. And those who take the lenient position say that what's the reason why microscopic insects are mutter? The reason is because Hashem doesn't expect us to do things beyond what humans are capable of. We call it lanit netam malachei hasharis. How Hashem didn't expect me to know that thing was usher. I can't even see it. How would He expect me to know and therefore not eat it? And if so, so we don't have to do superhuman skills to figure something out. So that same logic would apply to say is that if I could see it with the naked eye, but I can't tell what it is, again, the Torah didn't expect me to know that thing was usher, and that would be a reason why it should be mutter. Now, so this big difference of opinion sounds theoretical, but it has lots and lots of applications, and it serves as a big dividing line, a big explanation, depending on which side of this question you're on, will depend on how and whether certain vegetables need to be checked and cleaned, etc. Based on which bugs do you consider to be small enough that they're mutter, and which ones are bigger and that they're considered to be visible, that they do have to be gotten rid of.